This is lesson number 2 of the book of Exodus, and the title of this lesson is God Delivers Israel from Egypt. You can also think of it as God Delivers Israel from Bondage. And we're covering the first 19 chapters of Exodus. The objective of this lesson is the revelation of God to the world. God is showing himself to the whole world. This is the biggest display of the revelation of God since creation. And the subject is that God provides freedom from bondage. So we could go and free slaves, right? But nowhere in the history of mankind was a whole nation delivered from slavery. A whole nation. And this was the time in history when this happened. The key text that I'm using here is Exodus 9:16, and then 15:11 and 18:11. But 9:16 says, "But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." And there's your answer to that question. Why did God bring the Israelites out of Egypt by unleashing all these plagues on them? And here he was revealing himself. It says, "For this very purpose, that I might show my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." That's what God's purpose was. I want everyone in the world to know that I exist. I created this earth, heavens and the earth. So look at chapter 15 and verse 11. "Who among the gods is like you, O Lord? Who is like you? Majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders." So God is saying, there is no gods like me. I am the God, and there's none but me. So chapter 18 and verse 11. "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly." And those are the key verses. So Genesis closes with the family of Jacob. And about 300 years later, Exodus opens with the nation of Israel. Family of Jacob, nation of Israel. The Jacob family grew into a nation, and for the first time they are called Israelites. So God was busy fulfilling his promise to Abraham in making him the father of a great nation. Now in this lesson we will see how God revealed himself to Israel, to Egypt, and to the rest of the world. Remember, in our introduction to the Bible lesson, we learned that the Bible is God's revelation of himself to mankind. So if you ever think of what is the Bible really, it's God's revelation of himself to mankind. So in Genesis, God revealed himself as creator, full of wisdom and knowledge, and he showed his attributes of holy and gracious. We've seen that through the stories of Genesis. He revealed himself quite closely to Abraham, to Isaac, and very closely to Jacob. Now in Exodus, we see God revealing himself to Moses and Israel, to Pharaoh and Egypt, and also to the rest of the world. And as we go through the Bible, we'll see how God continues to reveal himself in every book of the Bible. Every book. So there's 66 books in the Bible, and all of them give us the revelation of God. For every one that we go through, the light gets brighter. The knowledge of God increases for us. The Bible is God's autobiography. It's God writing about himself to mankind. It's his identification book, and you know what that is. In South Africa, it's our ID book. The Bible is God's ID book. It's identifying God, and we know it is a revelation of God. So as we look at chapters 1 through to chapter 4 and verse 17, that's the first section, God chooses Moses to lead Israel. So looking at chapter 1, many years have passed, and Joseph and his brothers and all that generation had died, ending with Genesis. But their children continue to grow and become a mighty nation. Look at chapter 1 and verse 7 of Exodus. "But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them." God was fulfilling his purpose here. He's fulfilling his promise of providing this great nation. So what we're seeing in that verse is fulfillment. And this proves that God keeps his promise. If God says it, he'll do it. No oppression, slave drivers, or ruthlessness, or forced labor, or hard work, or bitterness, or even murder could be an obstacle to what God planned to do. If God planned to do something, nothing's going to stop him. So no matter how bad Pharaoh treated the Israelites, his plan backfired because the Egyptians were the ones who became fearful. Look at verse 12. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. I mean, the Egyptians were treating Israel as slaves and oppressing them, trying to kill their children and everything. But the more they did that to the Israelites, the more kids they had, the more there was a population explosion. So if you think that you want to have a lot of babies, maybe you need some oppression in your lives. The magnitude of this nation made the new Pharaoh very uneasy and hateful towards the Israelites. This Pharaoh did not know who Joseph was and the debt that Egypt owed to him. It seems that Egyptians forgot their own history and how they became a great country. They got to go back in their history and thank Joseph for becoming such a great country. But the Pharaoh forgot. He didn't know who Joseph was. The God of Jacob made Egypt a superpower during those 7 years of famine. But the ignorant and fearful Pharaoh began to oppress the people of Jacob. He treated them as slaves. And he ordered the murder of newborn babies by throwing them into the river Nile. He thought that he could stop the population explosion, but he could not succeed because the more Israel was oppressed, the more they grew. And we just read that in verse 12. So looking at chapter 2, under Egyptian oppression, God began his plan to free Israel. Moses was drawn out from the very river where Israelite children were being drowned. So God can take an evil situation and turn it around for good. God can take the very cruelty of men and turn it into a blessing. Kill all the babies, but out of the river, he drew a child. And that was for the good. Moses did not drown in the river because his mother put him in a basket that was insulated with tar and pitch. She coated it with pitch so that it became unsinkable. So the name Moses means to draw out. From the midst of the bondage and slavery, God drew out his instrument to liberate. The very daughter of Pharaoh took the Israelite boy child and raised him up in the palace of Pharaoh. And that's how powerful and great God is. He could do that. The very Egyptians who tried to snuff out the Israelites raised up Israel's liberator, and they didn't even know it. Moses was given the best food, clothing, accommodation, education in Egypt. You know what? For the first 40 years of his life, he was trained in Pharaoh's palace to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. The Egyptians didn't even know it. God was doing that. Yet he never lost his identity of who he was growing up in Pharaoh's palace. He still knew he was an Hebrew. One day when Moses grew up and he saw an Egyptian slave driver beating an Israelite, and then he killed that Egyptian slave driver. The next day when he tried to stop a fight between two Israelites, one of them made him aware that killing the Egyptian became public knowledge. He said, Moses, you want to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? So when Pharaoh heard that Moses had did this, he tried to kill Moses, and then Moses became very afraid and escaped to the land of Midian. Now, Midianites, if you go back to the book of Genesis, you can find out who they are and where did they come from. They came from the son of Abraham's second wife, Keturah. It's one of the sons, Midian. So there Moses met a priest of Midianite country and he married his daughter. In the meantime, God heard the bitter cries of the suffering Israelites, and God was concerned about them. At the same time, God did not forget his covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That would be about 430 years earlier. So looking at chapters 3 and 4, in answer to prayer and remembrance of the covenant with Abraham, the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in the burning bush. The angel of the Lord told Moses that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So let's look at verse 2 and then verse 4 and 6. Exodus chapter 3, verse 2. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flames of fire from within the bush. Moses saw that the bush was on fire, but it did not burn up. Now look at verses 4, 5, and 6. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. Who called to him? God did. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Here we see the angel of the Lord declaring himself to be God. We talked about the angel of the Lord in the book of Genesis. It was the angel of the Lord in the flames of fire. And the fact that the angel of the Lord is saying, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Who's the angel of the Lord? He's declaring himself to be God here. So in Genesis, he was acknowledged as God. Know the story of Hagar in the desert, and the angel of the Lord appeared to her? So she acknowledged him that the angel of the Lord was God. Now in this book, Exodus, God declares himself that he's God. The angel of the Lord declares himself that he is God. Now God starts the rescue plan by firstly revealing himself to Moses and then to the Israelites. So God chose Moses to be his instrument to lead his Israelites out of slavery and then take them into a land of milk and honey. So look at verses 3 and 10. So Moses thought, I will go over and see the strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. Now look at verse 10. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So God had chosen him to be the instrument to lead Israel out of Egypt. Moses doubts that he can do such a thing, or that he can even be the instrument of God. But God gives him the assurance that he is with him. Tell the Israelites, I am sent you. Verse 14 says, God said to Moses, I am who I am. And this is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am sent you. I am means that God is unchanging. It's not I was and I will be. I always am. Is immutable. And therefore his promise to Abraham has not changed. Then God gave him the name the Lord, which of course we see in our English Bibles, but in Hebrew it's Yahweh. Or in Greek it's Jehovah, which means eternal, the eternal. God also gave Moses a few miracles because of his uncertainties and insecurities. You know, when he had to throw the stick on the ground and he became a snake, God turned his staff into a snake and made his arm leprous. So look at chapter 4 and verses 8 and 9. Then the Lord said, if you do not believe, if they do not believe you or pay attention to the first miraculous sign, they may believe the second. In verse 9, but if they do not believe these two signs or listen to you, then take water from the Nile and pour it on the ground, on the dry ground. The water that you take from the river will become blood on the ground. And look at verse 17. But take the staff in your hand so that you can perform miraculous signs with it. There's something that we need to know about miracles here. That the passage indicates that miracles are a sign because of unbelief. God says, Moses says, if they don't believe me, what do I do? Well, do this miracle. Miracles are a sign because of unbelief, not for those who believe. So, then God gave Moses further assurance by telling him, I will be with you. And that's what we saw in chapter 3 and verse 12. Then God said, I will be with you. And this will be a sign that it is I who sent you. God gave him that assurance. I will be with you. I will help you to speak and teach you what to say. So let's continue reading verse 12. Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. Now, how easy is God making it for Moses? He didn't quite take God for his word at first. I will send your brother to help you as well, is what God said to him. So although unbelief does not please the Lord, he still continues to work with man. God had to tarry with Moses because he just didn't want to believe. So look at verses 13 through to 15. But Moses said, O Lord, please send someone else to do it. After turning his rod into a snake, turning his arm to become leprous and then healing him, Moses still says, Lord, please send somebody else. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, what about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and his heart will be glad when he sees you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth, and I will help both of you to speak and will teach you what to do. God is really patient. If you and I were God then, I don't think we would have been that patient. But let's look at chapters 4 through verse 18, right up to chapter 11. God reveals himself to Pharaoh and the Egyptians. So Moses was God's instrument, but God was actually freeing the Israelites from bondage. Look at chapter 6 and verse 6. Therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. So God told Moses that Pharaoh will not permit the Israelites to leave. He won't let them go. And we saw that in chapter 3 and verse 19. Let's just go back there. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. But God is going to take the very evil situation of Egypt and Pharaoh and use it for his good purpose. So God took Pharaoh's stubbornness and used it to reveal himself to the whole world. That's what we read in 9:16. But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. Even the Israelites were to gain knowledge of the one true God, and there is no other God. Even Israel needed a revelation of God. So chapter 10 and verse 2, that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and how I performed these signs among them, and that you may know that I am the Lord. What's God's purpose? That your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, for all the generations to come, tell them the story, because they all need to know that I am. That's what's God's purpose. The phrase I am the Lord appears 17 times in the book of Exodus, meaning that God is revealing himself. Why would God keep saying, I am the Lord? I want you to know me, is what God is saying. So the book of Exodus can be seen as a worldwide proclamation of the knowledge of God. So if you want an overall idea of what the book of Exodus is about, it's a worldwide proclamation of the knowledge of God. Pharaoh's unbelief typified the world's unbelief. Chapter 5 and verse 2. Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." So Pharaoh hardened his heart. It typified the rest of the world because the rest of the world didn't know who God was either. So why would someone come and say, "I'm going to do what the Lord says because the prophet says so"? I don't know the Lord. Well, that's God's purpose, that He wanted the world to know that He exists. And that was the problem. People did not know God. But now God was making Himself known to the world. And one of the ways that God did this was by proving that the gods of Egypt are not gods at all. So God was challenging the gods of Egypt. I don't know if you want to maybe call it the battle of the gods. But that was the situation. God was proving that they were not gods at all. So look at 12:12. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. God is saying this is one of the reasons why I'm bringing these plagues, to prove that all the gods of Egypt are false. Because I am the true God. God is showing the world that idolatry or idols is a creation of the hands of man. The gods, the magicians, the sorcerers of Egypt were incapable of reversing any of the plagues. Their gods were powerless to save them. I would think that these magicians were a bit silly. They were able to replicate some of the miracles that Moses did. So if Moses and Aaron brought in frogs, Pharaoh's magicians brought more frogs. I mean, what were they doing? Making more disaster? They couldn't get rid of the frogs, though. Their gods were powerless to save them, and that's how God showed them that He is the only God in existence. But by the 8th plague, some of the Egyptians got converted. But the 8th plague. Look at chapter 8 and verse 19. The magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hard and he would not listen, just as the Lord had said. Look at chapter 9 and verses 20 and 21. Those officials of Pharaoh who feared the word of the Lord, these Egyptians, some of them, who were fearing the word of the Lord, hurried to bring their slaves and their livestock inside. And those who ignored the word of the Lord left their slaves and livestock in the field. And you know what happened? Those were the livestock that were killed, and those people. It seems that Egypt considered their firstborn sons and firstborn animals to be their gods as well. So looking at chapter 12 and verse 12, on that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every what? Firstborn, both men and animals. And I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. So it seems like Egypt considered all their firstborn to be gods. So the Lord threatened to destroy their gods, who were their firstborns, if they refused to listen and free Israel, whom God considered to be His firstborn. So jump back to chapter 4 and verse 22 and 23. They then say to Pharaoh, "This is what the Lord says, Israel is my firstborn son. And I told you, let my son go so he may worship me. But you refused to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son." This is what God said to the Egyptians. So He said, the Israelites is my firstborn son. But God never considered His son Israel to be a god, to be worshipped. It was the other way around. Israel worshipped God, not God worshipped Israel. And so the 10th plague of death was the final blow on Egyptians' firstborn gods. Chapter 11 and verse 8. all these officials of yours will come to me, bowing down before me and saying, Go, you and all the people will follow you. After that I will leave. Then Moses, hot with anger, left Pharaoh. So that was during the plague of the firstborn, or the death of the firstborns. So the nation of Israel is born, as recorded in the book of Exodus. They never existed prior to this. A nation was born, the Israelites. And God wanted them to know Him by name. And what was God's name for the Israelites? It was Yahweh or Jehovah. Go back to chapter 6 and verse 2 and 3. Then the Lord said to Moses, that's the first verse. Go to verse 2. God also said to Moses, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, the Lord, which is the name Jehovah or Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. So God did not make Himself known as Yahweh to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He made Himself known as God Almighty, which I think the Hebrew word is El Shaddai. But to Israel, He says, I want you to know my name as Jehovah, the Eternal. So God made a covenant with them. Look at verse 7. I will make you as my own people. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you up from under the yoke of the Egyptians. When God said that He will harden Pharaoh's heart, and that's in 4:21. Look at that. And the Lord said to Moses, when you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders that I have given you the power to do. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. It is because Pharaoh first hardened his heart. Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And then God said, I will harden his heart. So if you read 4:21, prior to 4:21 is 3:19. Go to 3:19. He says, but I know the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So God is saying, no, He is initially not letting the Israelites go. He's not doing it just because I hardened his heart. I only hardened his heart after He hardened his own heart. Further. So think about this. The first plague that took place, Pharaoh hardened his heart in 722. The second plague that took place, Pharaoh hardened his heart again in chapter 8 and verse 15. The third plague that took place, Pharaoh's heart was hard and he would not listen, 8:19. The fourth plague that took place, Pharaoh hardened his heart, chapter 8 verse 32. The fifth plague, his heart was unyielding and he would not let the people go, 9:7. The sixth plague, the sixth one, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So for the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh was hardening his own heart. And that's in 9:12. The 7th plague, Pharaoh and his officials hardened their hearts, 9:34. The 8th plague, God hardened the heart of Pharaoh and his officials, chapter 10, verse 1. And plagues 9 and 10, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. And you can see that in 10:20, 27, 11:10, and 14:8. I'll give you the scriptures so that you can look them up. God's purpose to free the Israelites was so that they may what? Worship Him. Chapter 8 and verse 1. 7 days passed after the Lord struck the Nile. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, this is what the Lord says, let my people go so that they may worship me. The distinction God made between Israel and Egypt was worship. And so Israel was separated from idol worshippers. Israel, you don't worship man-made gods. You need to worship the true God. And that's what separated Egypt from Israel. Pharaoh's magicians and sorcerers were unable to counterfeit the same miracles. Actually, they were able to counterfeit some of the miracles, only to find out that by the third plague, that they were really silly in doing that. So chapter 8 and verse 19 says, the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. Don't ask us to replicate those miracles anymore now. This is God's doing. It's quite amazing. They were just adding to the disaster upon themselves. By the 8th plague, Pharaoh's officials were begging Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Chapter 10 and verse 7. Pharaoh's officials said to him, "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go, so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not realize that Egypt is ruined?" So some of Pharaoh's officials had some sense to say to Pharaoh, "Why are you keeping them back? The country is getting destroyed." The magicians and sorcerers were never able to reverse any of the plagues. So let's look at chapters 12 through to 14. The Passover of protection and deliverance. For the Israelites, the blood of the Passover lamb meant protection and deliverance. So if you want the one idea of what is the Passover lamb in the book of Exodus, it's protection and deliverance. In the final plague of death, God protected the Israelites with the blood of the lamb on the doorposts. If no blood was applied to the doorposts of anyone's home, and you could be an Israelite, it didn't matter. If there was no blood on the doorpost, then they would have to experience the death of their firstborn. In this way, God separated and delivered Israel from Egypt. It was a day to remember. This would be the biggest day for them. So to commemorate this great day of deliverance, God asked them to celebrate the Passover once a year. After you get out, Israelites, remember this day and celebrate it as a day of Passover, an ordinance for generations to come. Let your children celebrate it, and your grandchildren, and so on. So look at chapter 12 and verse 14. This is a day you are to commemorate. So in other words, do this day in order to remember. For the generations to come shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. And in the years to come, when your children ask, what is the meaning of this celebration? Because children born after that have never seen any of this stuff. And your children would ask the question, what is the meaning of this celebration? They are to explain how the Lord delivered them from slavery in Egypt. So look at 12, 26 and 27. And when your children ask you, what does the ceremony mean to you? Then tell them, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. Then the people bowed down and worshipped. Now look at chapter 13 and verse 14. In days to come, when your son asks, what does this mean? Say to him, with a mighty hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So how would the children be learning what happened? They ask questions. Why are you celebrating this festival? What does it mean? Here's the reason. Children not yet born and have never seen their deliverance will be taught by asking questions. Parents are to celebrate the Passover, the Lord's deliverance, in a way that encourages their children to ask questions and learn. In addition to the Passover celebration, they must have a 7-day festival of unleavened bread to remind them that their departure from Egypt was speedy. It had to be quick. And that's why they had to celebrate a festival for 7 days of unleavened bread. So 12:17 says, celebrate the feast of unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. Now look at verse 19. For 7 days no yeast is to be found in your houses, and whoever eats anything with yeast must be cut off from the community of Israel, whether he is an alien or native born. Now go to verse 39. With the dough they made, they had brought from Egypt, they baked cakes of unleavened bread Now you see why the reason they made unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have the time to prepare food for themselves. So if you ladies know about baking or cooking, if you had to put yeast in the dough, you had to wait for it to rise. It takes time. But Israel had to get out of Egypt very, very quick. So don't put yeast into the bread. Just bake it so it'll be done very quickly. So now when Israel celebrates the feast of unleavened bread, the children would ask, why don't we put yeast in the bread? Well, we had to get out of Egypt in a hurry. They're getting the old story. It's a revelation of God, basically. God had delivered us from Egypt. Interestingly, when God delivered them on the 7th month, which is a month of Abib, later the name came to be Nisan, or Nisan, of the Jewish calendar. He changed this month to the first month of the year. So God took the 7th month and made it the first month for the Israelites. Look at chapter 12 and verse 2. This month is to be the month. This month is to be for you the first month, and the first month of your year. See that? And chapter 13 and verse 4. Today in the month of Abib, you are leaving. So you see why God changed that month to the first month. It was the 7th month when they actually left Egypt, and that month now became a first month in the Jewish calendar. This month of deliverance became the new year for Israel to celebrate every year as a festival to the Lord. So you get the idea of a Jewish calendar, and how the 7th month became the first month, and every year they celebrate a new year on that 7th month. God gave specific instructions for exactly how they are to celebrate the Passover. Interestingly, God never allowed Israel to come up with their own method of worship. God didn't say to Israel, worship me however you feel like worshiping. No. God says, I will teach you how to worship me. So let's look at chapter 13. Also, to commemorate this day, the Israelites were to consecrate, that is, set apart their firstborn sons and firstborn animals to the Lord. Chapter 13 and verse 15. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed every firstborn in Egypt, both men and animals. This is why I sacrifice to the Lord the firstborn male offspring of every womb, and redeem each of my firstborn sons. So God is not killing the firstborn sons, only the firstborn animals. So the worship was always to remember the things that God did. So every time Israel worshipped, like the celebration of the Passover, was a worship to God. It reminded them of the things that God did. So when they celebrated the feast of unleavened bread, it reminded them of the things that God did. So when they sacrificed the firstborn of the animals, it reminded them of what God did. So every time they worshipped, what they did was a reminder of what God did. That's worship. Your worship must reflect what God is like. He is compassionate, He is gracious, He is merciful, He is holy, and what He does. And that's what true worship is in the Bible. So Egypt made gods out of their firstborns, but Yahweh required Israel's firstborn animals to be sacrificed as a reminder of the great deliverance. It wasn't that God says, no, we need to follow the pattern of the world, let's sacrifice firstborn animals. No, God says, I want you to sacrifice the firstborn animals as a reminder that I destroyed the firstborn gods of Egypt. So all the firstborn animals were sacrificed, but the firstborn sons must be redeemed, so that children must not be put to death. And that's what you read in verse 15. As an act of faith, Moses carried Joseph's bones from Egypt to the promised land. So when the Israelites left, you go back in the history of the Israelites, when Joseph died at least about 400 years or 350 years earlier, he gave instructions to the Israelites, when you do leave the land, take my bones with you. So look at chapter 13 and verse 19. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the sons of Israel swear an oath, he said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. Why did Joseph say that? He believed the promise that God made to Abraham, that I'm going to give you a land of milk and honey. Joseph said, don't bury me in Egypt. No matter how long it takes, when you leave here and get to the promised land, take my bones with you. It's because here was a man who was dead. Just his bones left. And he still had faith in the promise of God. How interesting is that? Joseph requested this about 300 years ago, as he knew that this day will definitely come. And you can read that in Genesis 50 verses 24 and 25. So whether in life or in death, belief in the promises of God remains the same. And as the Israelites carried Joseph's bones on the journey that God led them by the pillar of cloud, it was God who led them by a pillar of cloud at daylight and a pillar of fire at night. So let's look at chapter 14. Now the first test of faith after they left the camp by the sea was when Pharaoh's army came after them. Wow, it's like God is testing the faith of the Israelites. They left Egypt. First test of faith. Pharaoh's army is coming after them. Pharaoh was evil. But God used his evil art to gain glory for himself. Look at chapter 14 and verse 4. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. Only God could use evil and turn it around for his glory. The Israelites were terrified when they saw Pharaoh's army coming after them. Then Moses encouraged the people with words of faith. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. Come on, Israel, you saw all the miracles. You don't believe now? You're afraid? So Moses said to the Israelites, the Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. Then the Lord parted the Red Sea for the Israelites to cross over on dry land, dry ground, while he held the Egyptian army back. And when the Israelites were safely across on the other side, the Lord then let the Egyptian army to go into the sea, onto the dry land as well, which he then caused to flow back and drown them all. This was a miracle. Remember how Pharaoh decreed all Israelite male babies to be drowned in the river Nile? But now the tables are turned, and Pharaoh's army is drowning in the sea. God's punishment on the Egyptians was equal to the crime. You kill the Israelites, you will pay with your life. It was a punishment that was equal to the crime. Who can fight against the Lord? So let's look at chapters 15 through to 19, the beginning of freedom. Chapter 15, God just finished a worldwide revelation of himself, and Israel began to sing a song of freedom and joy. They just got the freedom, and they wrote the first song, and they sang it and danced to a song of freedom and joy. So chapter 15 and verse 3, the Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. This is a lyric of a song. In verse 11, who among the gods is like you, O Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? Put a melody to that. God planned this for the world to know that who he is. Look at verses 14 and 15. The nations will hear and tremble. Anguish will grip the peoples of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom will be terrified. The leaders of Moab will seize with trembling. The people of Canaan will melt away. Terror and dread will fall upon them. All the nations of the world came to know about this. But sadly, the joyful songs of Israel turn into bitter grumbling, and this is the part that we feel sad to keep going with the story. The joyful songs turned into bitter grumbling. They showed a lack of trust when they came to the waters of Meribah. Look at verses 23 and 24. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That is why that place is called Mara. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" The same people that were singing songs of joy are now grumbling. And after making their bitter waters sweet, God made a decree that if they listen to his voice, he will not inflict on them any of the diseases that he brought upon the Egyptians. Verses 25 and 26. Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood that he threw into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made a decree and a law with them, and there he tested them. And he said, "If you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." From Mara they traveled to Elim, where they found plenty of water. Next week we will take a look at the chart and look at the journey that they took as they traveled from place to place, from Mara and then to Elim. So look at chapter 16. It wasn't too long after this that the Israelites began to complain again. On arriving in the desert of Sin, they complained about not having food to eat. God then rained down manna from heaven, and he also gave them quail. It seems that every time God tested their faith, they disbelieved and failed the test. Faith, which is what? Trust in God, means to depend on God each and every day. Depend on God. So trust God each and every day. The supply of manna was miraculous. God did not let them keep any of it overnight for 5 days, or else it will rot. Eat what you need for today. Don't keep for tomorrow. It will rot if you see it in the morning. Why did God do that? God says, I want you to depend on me for tomorrow. You don't depend on yourself for tomorrow. So only in the 6th day, they were allowed to collect for 2 days, and the manna never rotted. It stayed fresh. It's a miracle. God did this because he wanted them to rest on the 7th day. No work for that day. So look at verses 29 and 30 of chapter 16. Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath, which is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where he is on the 7th day. No one is to go out. So the people rested on the 7th day. God gave them the Sabbath day as a day of rest. Verse 23. He said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning." The Sabbath day, don't do any work, just it's a day of rest. The manna was food unlike anything that anyone knew. It's miraculous. It tasted like wafers made with honey. No man has seen anything like it. The manna actually stopped after 40 years when the Israelites crossed the Jordan and entered the promised land. On that very day, that manna stopped raining down from heaven. So let's look at chapter 17. Sadly, as they arrived at Rephidim, there's another place that they stopped at. They grumbled yet again about the lack of water. So God told Moses to strike the rock of Oreb with his staff, and water will come out, and all the people can drink. Moses named that place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord. The question is, why didn't the Israelites trust God after all that they saw him doing? What's happening with these people? Now the Amalekites made an attack on the Israelites while they were still at Rephidim. Here was another nation, Amalekites, came along and started to attack the Israelites. So Moses commissioned Joshua to choose the fighting men and lead them into battle against the Amalekites. And Moses went to the top of the hill and held his hands up for the Israelites to win. As long as he held his hands up, the Israelites were winning. But when he got tired and he started to drop his hands, the Israelites started to lose. And the Amalekites started to win. So Moses grew tired. When he grew tired, Aaron and 2 people held his hands up until sunset, and Joshua defeated the Amalekites. See, where two people assisted Moses in keeping his hands up. This showed that Moses could not be a leader on his own. He needed leaders in partnership. That's what we see in this story. Moses worshipped God and called that place Jehovah Nissi. The Lord is our banner. The banner of the Lord signified victory in war. When you think of the Lord is our banner, it's victory in battle. So God told Moses to keep a written record of this war, as he will totally wipe out the Amalekites from the memory of the earth for what they did to Israel. We don't have any Amalekites in the world today, do we? We still have Israelites though. So look at chapter 18. Jethro, which is Moses' father-in-law, hears all about how God delivered the Israelites, and he worshipped God with sacrifices. Aaron and all the elders joined him in the worship. It was just man was like a chief man. He worships God, and Aaron and all the elders join him. The next day Jethro observed how Moses worked from morning till evening with the people's problems. There were about 2 to 3 million people, right? And people had problems, so they brought it to Moses. And from morning till evening, Moses was sitting and working with people's problems every day. Jethro sees this. So Jethro taught Moses how to lighten the load while still maintaining his leadership. Easy cases can be judged by other leaders who have proven to be faithful, honest, and reliable. Only the difficult cases need to be brought to Moses. Who is this man Jethro? Is the question. He was not an Israelite, yet he was a priest of God. He taught Moses how to organize the justice system. He was teaching Moses how to organize the justice system of a nation, and he worshipped the same God. So chapter 19, 3 months after leaving Egypt, they arrived at Mount Sinai. On arrival, Moses went up the mountain and received a message from the Lord. At this mountain, God made a covenant with the nation of Israel. So look at chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. Now, if you obey me and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. Now, this is not the same covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Don't mix up the covenant that God made with Abraham with the covenant that God made with Israel. It's two different covenants. Covenant with Israel is a conditional one. Just consider the words in verse 5. If and then. If you do this, then I will do that. It's a conditional covenant. God's covenant with Abraham was unconditional. Consider the words in Genesis chapter 12, the first 3 verses. I will make you the father of a great nation. Not if you do this, I will make you the father. So that was not a conditional covenant. So 2 different covenants, right? When the people heard the covenant, they responded with a declaration of commitment. Verse 8, the people all responded together, we will do everything the Lord has said. So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. That was a declaration of commitment. Documented. And in this covenant with Israel, God sets barriers that the people are not allowed to cross. So look at verses 12 and 13. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not go up the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain will surely be put to death. He shall surely be stoned and shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid on him, whether man or animal, he shall not be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horns sounds a long blast may they go up to the mountain. Now look at verse 23. Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy. The Israelites were not allowed into the presence of the Lord. Then the glory of the Lord descended on the mountain, and the people were terrified. It was like a volcano eruption. The mountain just smoked, and fire was there, and then they heard the sound of the trumpet that was so loud that they trembled with fear. It wasn't a volcano eruption, though, because they wouldn't be able to still stand at the foot of the mountain. There was no lava that flowed down the mountain. It was God displaying himself. The glory of God descended on the mountain, and the people were terrified. It is worthwhile to note that at the very introduction of this covenant, there was great fear. Look at verse 16. On that morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. So, in conclusion, what can we say? God's act in delivering Israel from Egypt was his greatest revelation of himself to mankind since creation. This was a worldwide display. God is saying, I want to show the world that I exist and I am the creator. So God wanted the world to know that he is the only God in existence, and they needed to stop worshipping gods made by their own hands. The nation of Israel acknowledges historically. They acknowledge it, and God's purpose was to make himself known to the world. That was God's purpose here, to make himself known to the world. Look at chapter 9 and verse 16. But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. Let us bow our heads in prayer. Father, we are thankful for the book of Exodus. We're thankful that we've been through Genesis and we understand where we are in the history of man, but we also understand how you are revealing yourself more and more as time goes to people. We are grateful for your compassion and grace to all the people of the earth. In that we are grateful in Jesus' name. Amen.